Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture by Professor Daniela Bleichmar. Thank you for coming. My name is Anita Berrizbeitia, and I am Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture. Before we start, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available. To enable captions, click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. I also wanted to invite you this Thursday, October 28th at 12 noon to join us for the launch event of Harvard Design Magazine number 49, titled Publics, which I co-edited with Diane Davis. More information about this event is available on our website. It is my great pleasure to introduce Daniela Bleichmar, Professor of Art History and History at the University of Southern California, whose scholarship has strong resonance with many of our own concerns in landscape architecture today. This is indeed a fruitful moment of convergence between the fields of history and design around questions of environmental knowledge and its role in processes of large-scale landscape transformation. For upwards of a decade, Daniela's research has focused on the production and dissemination of, among other topics, botanical knowledge in early modern Europe and colonial Latin America in the years after the conquest, when a turn from mineral extraction to botanical production becomes a key enterprise in empire building. I highlight a few aspects of her work that are specifically relevant to us: the intertwining of art and science in the production of knowledge, the reading of process in the making of books, images, and codices as an important component of the production of meaning, cultural exchange and co-production of knowledge between indigenous peoples and European scientists, and political ecology as framework for the examination of environmental change. These have been central topics of her two books, Visible Empire, Botanical Expeditions and Visual Culture in the Hispanic Enlightenment, published in 2012, and Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin of 2017, both of which have won many awards, and to her current project, The History of the Codex Mendoza, one of the earliest accounts of pre-Hispanic Aztec life. Today, she will be presenting her work on red dye production by the Aztec and Maya peoples when it becomes Mexico's second export commodity between the 15th and the 18th century as it enters the world markets. Please welcome Professor Daniela Bleichmar for her lecture, The History of Cochineal and Mexican Indigenous Knowledge, circa 1500 to 1800.
Thank you so much, Anita Berrizbeitia, for that warm welcome and for the invitation to participate in this series. I am delighted to be here and looking forward to hearing from the perspective of landscape designers and architects more generally. My thanks also to Paige Johnston and Kat Chavez for all their help with the preparations for this talk, and to Matthew Smith for the tech support. So as Anita, let me share the screen. Here we go. So as Anita mentioned, today I will be discussing with you the history of cochineal in Mexico and Europe during what historians call the early modern period, roughly 1500 to 1800, as a case study for thinking about the role of indigenous knowledge in the histories of science, empire, and global knowledge production during this time. And what I will be talking about is this little insect, a tiny insect really, that is native to the Americas and that live on cacti, most notably the prickly-pear cactus or nopal. After being dried and prepared, the body of the female can then be crushed to yield a brilliant red colorant. And this use was common throughout pre-Hispanic America. Conservators have found cochineal in multiple Mesoamerican objects. And to give you just one example, the Codex Tonindeye, also known as the Codex Uxnotal, from the Nutzawi or Mixtec people of present-day Oaxaca, Mexico, a major region of cochineal production in pre-Hispanic and colonial Mexico, as well as today. So the presence of cochineal in the pre-Hispanic indigenous economy is also documented in an important indigenous manuscript from early colonial Mexico, the Codex Mendoza, where it appears in a section on the economy of the Mexica or Aztec Empire, shown in 3 separate pages as tribute paid to Tenochtitlan by the towns in the Mixtec regions of Coixtlahuacan, Coyolapan, and Tlaxquillauco. White bags with red dots depicting the insect colorant are accompanied by pictographic numbers specifying the amounts that each province paid. 40 bags, 20 bags, and 5 bags, respectively. And the cochineal payment is registered in close proximity on the page to tributes of other valuable materials. I am showing you at top gourds filled with gold dust and a tlalpiloni, a prize hair ornament with double feathered tassels that was worn by elite men. At bottom left, large pieces of gold, and at bottom right, large quantities of the long green tail feathers of the shimmering quetzal, also highly valued in the indigenous economy. So we're seeing that it's associated with extremely valuable objects. Analysis of numerous early colonial indigenous manuscripts have established the continued use of cochineal red, and there's many examples: Codices Selden, Huejotzinco, Borbonicus, the Selden roll, the Humboldt fragments, and so on and so forth. So the presence of cochineal in painted manuscripts many decades after the imposition of Spanish colonial rule documents a continuity of native pictorial and material practices alongside more recently introduced European materials, which indigenous artists also used. So Spaniards took quick notice of cochineal. Hernán Cortés sent a sample to Spain as early as 1518, and soon after, Spanish colonies started promoting and overseeing indigenous cultivation of the insect. By 1526, only 5 years after the fall of the Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan, Spaniards were already exporting cochineal from Mexico to Europe. It turned out that this novel American dye yielded a much more intense and durable red than any other colorant known at the time. It was 10 to 12 times more powerful than the next best red colorant. Economic historians have estimated that over the course of the 3 centuries of Spanish rule, cochineal ranked as the second most valuable export product in colonial New Spain. Its economic value surpassed only by that of silver. And so cochineal became part of a vigorous global trade. The major transatlantic route took cochineal from New Spain to the Spanish port of Seville and later Cadiz, and from there to France, Flanders, and England. European traders in turn moved the material to Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the Levant, Persia, Egypt, and India, as well as through a circum-African route to South Asia and Indonesia. After the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in the 1570s, a trans-Pacific route carried it from the port of Acapulco to Manila, and from there to Japan, China, and South Asia. And this global commodity was produced exclusively in the Spanish Americas, and as a result was a very valuable Spanish commercial monopoly. Although this species is native to multiple sites across the Americas, the cochineal industry developed above all in the region of Oaxaca, about 300 miles southeast of Mexico City, which yielded the finest cochineal and which throughout the colonial period and indeed till today had a majority indigenous population. In the mid-1790s, the Viceroy of New Spain estimated that 25,000 to 30,000 Oaxacans were employed in the cochineal industry. And the size of this industry was directly related to the demand, the global demand for cochineal. In 1799, the Prussian scientist Alexander von Humboldt, when he visited Mexico, estimated that Europe alone imported 80,000 pounds of cochineal per year, which amounts to a staggering total of 5.6 billion insects. So American cochineal became the most important red dye in the world until the introduction of synthetic dyes in the 19th century. And the examples of cochineal uses are numerous and well documented thanks to recent work by dozens of conservators in museums around the world. And I'm going to give you just some of the many, many examples. So cochineal has been identified in paintings from the mid-1500s by Tintoretto and Titian, among others, in Caravaggio's sensual reds from about half a century later, in the rich velvety textile in the background of Rubens' stunning posthumous portrait of his wife, Isabella Brandt, painted around 1626, the year of her death from plague at the age of 34, as well as a more austere drapery behind Archbishop Fernando de Valdés in Velázquez's portrait, and also in sections of Las Meninas, most notably the rich red drapery hanging behind the queen and king in the reflected mirror near the center of the canvas. Cochineal also provided the vivid red so central to Rembrandt's Isaac and Rebecca, better known as the Jewish Bride. And cochineal red is also ubiquitous in Spanish American paintings from the period, including examples by Cristóbal de Villalpando, where it provides the demonic red, and Sebastián López de Arteaga, or this wonderful 18th century portrait of a young woman with a harpsichord wearing a sumptuous vivid red dress made with embroidered silk. So for over 3 centuries, practically every single artistic and commercial product colored with red dye anywhere in the world depended on Mexican cochineal. And if by now you feel like I have taken you on a whirlwind tour of an incredible art exhibition, you are not mistaken, because the global history of cochineal as an artistic material has been the subject of 2 recent landmark exhibitions, one first organized by the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe in 2015 and seen in other venues in the United States, and the other held in Mexico City's Palacio de Bellas Artes in 2017 and 2018. But while the history of cochineal as a global commodity and artistic material is fascinating and important, today I want to focus on a different question. This colorant, used by artists and artisans around the world for centuries, traded so profitably by the Spanish crown, and as I will discuss, the subject of political intrigue and scientific controversies, was cultivated, harvested, and prepared by indigenous people, whose agricultural and environmental knowledge made cochineal available. The commercial products so valued around the globe resulted from a complex process that relied entirely on indigenous expertise and labor. It was indigenous men and women who knew how to meticulously care for both insects and cacti, who carried out the elaborate and painstaking method of cultivation and harvesting, and who processed the live insects by boiling, smoking, drying, and packaging them. So the question that I will be posing in my talk today is, what does cochineal reveal about indigenous knowledge in the early modern world? And to answer this question, I will explore 3 interconnected approaches to cochineal during this period. Approaching cochineal as an imperial secret, as a scientific mystery, and as Creole patriotic knowledge. And this word Creole, in Spanish criollo, has a very specific meaning in the Spanish-American context, where it refers to American-born individuals of Spanish descent. So to begin with cochineal as imperial secret, one of the most detailed and earliest colonial descriptions of the preparation and use of cochineal is also one of the very rare sources from this period that provides an indigenous perspective. The Florentine Codex, an encyclopedia of the Nahua world with texts in both Nahuatl and Spanish, and numerous illustrations, that was produced by indigenous authors and the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, in different versions over various decades of the mid-16th century, and completed in this form in the 1570s. A lengthy chapter addresses the preparation of paints by Nahua artists, which entailed great expertise in the selection and handling of materials. The highest quality red paint of a deep quote, chili red color was prepared from the bodies of dried cochineal insects cultivated on the prickly-pear cactus. The Nahuatl text recounts in detail the various stages of the insect's growth and cultivation, which are also portrayed in the illustration. And the Nahuatl text explains that the colorant produced by cochineal is named nochestli, or blood of the prickly pear, coming from the terms nochtli for the prickly pear cactus or opuntia and estli for blood. The Spanish text, which mistakenly claims that the paint comes from the insect's blood, refers to the product by its Spanish name, grana, and notes that, quote, it is very well known in this land and elsewhere, and there is great trade in it, reaching as far as China and as far as Turkey. Almost everywhere in the world, it is valued and esteemed greatly. So we see already two different perspectives, a Spanish imperial and commercial one, and an indigenous one focused on the cactus and the use by indigenous artists. And in the very same year, 1577, when the Florentine Codex was completed, the Spanish imperial administration distributed printed questionnaires to local administrators throughout the Spanish Americas. These are known as relaciones geográficas, and they were distributed to gather responses to questions that would be of use for the administration. So there were 51 questions, and local administrators were asked to record their responses for the town that they oversaw. And we see many questions that had to do with questions of agriculture, the landscape, and the environment, including some that are requesting information about native trees and the, quote, benefits to be gained from them, their fruit and their wood, asking people to state for what they are or could be useful, an interest in wheat, barley, wine, and olives, Spanish and natural commodities, but also an interest in silkworms or cochineal. So cochineal is already signaled as a subject of interest, and it's noteworthy that the very next question is about what we would today refer to as bioprospecting, looking for medicinal plants. And of the 166 responses from New Spain, 54 of them mention cochineal, so roughly 1/3. The information is often quite minimal, just very bare bones. Yes, there is cochineal, but not all that much. That's what everyone seems to say. Some of the respondents suggest that the cochineal trade could be developed further, and they always insist that this would be an enterprise led by Spaniards rather than one based on indigenous knowledge. The respondents characterized native people as being lazy or as lacking initiative due to their childlike nature, and thus in need of colonial stimulus to develop cochineal production, which is presented as something that would benefit both the empire and the indigenous population. Given the economic importance of this valuable American natural commodity, Spanish administrators in Europe and America actively sought information on the proper cultivation, harvesting, and preparation of cochineal for export, requesting memos from people involved in the trade and transmitting that information to high-placed administrators in Spain. And I'm showing you 2 pages from one of those documents authored in 1599 by a Spaniard named Gonzalo Gómez de Cervantes, who had served as governor of Tlaxcala in Mexico, and produced a memorial or report addressed to the Royal Council of the Indies, in which he detailed many aspects of colonial governance and administration, including information about, in this order, gold mining, silver mining, and the production of cochineal. Gómez de Cervantes writes that although many others had discussed cochineal, they had learned everything they knew from hearsay. By contrast, he insists that the information that he presents comes, quote, from sight, experience, and science, and emphasizes that he has what he refers to as hands-on, quote, experience, experiencia. This claim to empiricism is further supported by the choice to accompany the manuscript with a pictorial insert consisting of 12 drawings with textual explanations. The images show highly specific details emerging from the agricultural and environmental expertise of the indigenous laborers who worked in the cochineal industry. They show, for instance, on the left, the need to trim the cacti for propagating and to remove the fruits in the winter, and on the right, the maintenance of young plants and the careful placement of insects on the new plants once they are at least 6 months old, a laborious process that they call seeding. We also see the harvesting of cochineal at top left, and the careful preparation of plants for the next season at bottom left, and then techniques of the care of the opuntia, including removing fruits, clearing other plants that might damage the cactus, and what the cactus looks like at different points in its cycle, including one that has not been properly maintained. And for reasons of time, I won't get into this fascinating document in much detail, but I just want to make 2 quick points. The first is that this information must have come from indigenous expertise, but Gómez de Cervantes maintains throughout his text a condescending attitude toward indigenous people, describing them as lazy, indolent, and childlike. He presents himself as the source of the knowledge. So there's an explicit dissociation between what is characterized as labor and what is characterized as knowledge. And the second point that I want to make is the use of images and the specific information that they impart, which is very important. This is part of what I have described in publication as the constitution of an imperial visual archive, an epistemic strategy that I have argued characterized the early modern Spanish Empire, where images were routinely both requested and provided without solicitation as particularly powerful testimony that could capture and transport colonial information. And we see the repeated recourse to images in other reports or memoriales, such as this one from a 10-page manuscript on cochineal that was written in Mexico around 1620 to 1649. The document opens with a full-page illustration of the insects harvesting, depicting a man and a woman working below a magnificent, gigantic prickly-pear cactus. And while the man is bearded and wears a hat, the woman is identified as indigenous by her use of a huipil or tunic and the traditional hairstyle. And the text of this report is rich in local detail, describing the differences between different types of cochineal, fine cochineal, wild cochineal, noting the techniques used in Oaxaca and Tlaxcala, and arguing for the superiority of the colorant produced in the former. We see through these reports the rivalries between different producers in different regions and how they are competing for the market. The manuscript mentions the orders given by viceroys to local administrators regarding the work of the indigenous people, and meticulously details how the final product should be packaged and stored under lock and key by local officials to prevent fraud. Indeed, over the years, many reports address the need to maintain the quality of the product by avoiding its adulteration. It seems that producers constantly devised inventive ways to maximize the profits by mixing the insects with seeds, stones, and other substances. The manuscript thus highlights both the indigenous expertise in the technical aspects of plant and insect propagation and care, and the attention to questions of regulation, standardization of weights and quantities, and of the logical organization of the trade that concerned the viceregal administration. As I mentioned, Spain developed the cochineal trade at a time when the insect was a monopoly. It was unavailable to other European powers, and to the great consternation of the English, French, and Dutch competitors, Spain held the monopoly, the global monopoly on cochineal. And for this reason, Spanish viceregal authorities kept a tight lid on all information regarding the insect and its cultivation, which constituted valuable imperial secrets. And above all, they protected the insects themselves from falling into the hands of their competitors. At times, information did leak out. And so, for example, we see that the British naturalist Hans Sloane, in his Natural History of Jamaica, the second volume from 1725, he discussed and portrayed cochineal cultivation. So you're reading a book about the natural history of Jamaica, and all of a sudden you have this large fold-out plate saying, meanwhile, in Mexico, this is what's going on. And the intention is very clear. Sloane is hoping that the English will be able to somehow get live cochineal from Mexico and grow their own plantations in the Caribbean and compete with Spain in this valuable product. But they could not get their hands on the insects. And so this takes us to imperial sort of industrial espionage. In 1777, in what the French describe as a daring feat of successful espionage, and the Spanish as a brazen robbery, a French botanist entered Oaxaca under false pretenses. He claimed to be a Catalan doctor, and he collected samples of both the nopal cactus and the live insect and absconded with these precious materials to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, where he attempted to establish working plantations without success. 10 years later, the local scientific society published the posthumous accounts of his travels in Oaxaca, together with a lengthy preface promoting the budding Saint-Domingue cochineal industry, which, however, never managed to take off in the way that the French had hoped. So for the entirety of the viceregal period, cochineal remained a Spanish-American commodity and a Spanish imperial secret. And this secrecy and interest lead us to our second approach to cochineal, which is as a scientific mystery, because the secrecy surrounding cochineal was such that for centuries, people outside of Spanish America did not know what exactly cochineal was. Was it an animal or a vegetable? They could not determine this from the shriveled tiny pellets that arrived in Europe. And early accounts did little to clarify the matter, as authors could not agree on the answer to this basic question. So we have Francisco López de Gómara, Cortés's secretary and author of the influential General History of the Indies from 1552, claiming that the red dye came not from an insect, but from the fruit of the prickly-pear cactus. For his part, the Spanish scholar Francisco Cervantes de Salazar, who was twice the rector of the University of Mexico, the earliest Western university in the Americas, established in 1551, described what he called worm-like creatures. The English author Richard Hakluyt helped spread the notion that cochineal was a berry, based on the first-hand account of Robert Thompson, an Englishman who lived in Mexico in the 1550s. And the Spanish Jesuit, José de Acosta, who lived for years in Mexico and Peru and wrote a seminal natural history of the Americas, explained that cochineal was an insect that fed on the nopal cactus. The French explorer, Samuel de Champlain, referred to cochineal variously as the peas, seeds, and grains of the cactus, not helping to dispel the confusion. So by the early 1600s, cochineal had become a mystery, and numerous European scientists investigated its identity, in part because the question overlapped with two important areas of scientific research. One was microscopic observation, which was an exciting and rapidly developing technology, and the other was insect reproduction, which is part of a heated debate on generation. So the most celebrated naturalists, such as Claude-Joseph Geoffroy, Philippe de la Hire, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, Francesco Redi, Jan Swammerdam, Antonio Vallisneri, they all weighed in on this debate in correspondence and publications in the principal scientific journals of the time. Given Spanish trade secrecy, their research focused on their own observations in Europe, peering through their microscopes to examine the tiny desiccated objects in search of an eye or a limb that would establish them as animals or not. Nicholas Hertzogger's essay on dioptrics from 1694 included an illustration based on his microscopic observations, attesting that yes, cochineal was an insect. And in the text, he explained that he had to soak the dried cochineal for 2 or 3 days in water to rehydrate it in order to even observe it properly under the microscope. 10 years later, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, one of the foremost microscopists of the age, made the same argument in a letter to the Royal Society, which was published in the Philosophical Transactions with copperplate engravings based on Leeuwenhoek's drawings. But the matter remained controversial and unresolved for decades. The scientific evidence provided by the microscope was insufficient on its own to settle the issue, as observations were hard to make, to verify, to share, or to prove. The matter was definitely settled with the publication of Melchior de Ruscher's Natural History of Cochineal, justified by authentic documents from 1729. And like others before him, Ruscher conducted microscopic observations. So you see in figure 1 at the top, a life-size cochineal, and then figures 2, 3, and 5, different views of the cochineal from the microscope, and figure 4, a leg of a cochineal bug that allowed him to prove this was an insect. But the decisive evidence was not the microscopic observation, but what he called authentic documents, prominently advertised in the title of the publication, which he proceeded to transcribe in the treatise. The author explained that he had obtained these documents from a trustworthy person who had traveled to Mexico, examined witnesses in front of a notary, produced 3 certifications, 3 declarations, and 8 testimonies that had been overseen by a judge and notarized, and then travel back to Europe. You can just imagine the witnesses getting all these apparatus to ask, is it a berry or an insect when they are in cochineal? And of course, they are in Oaxaca, and of course it is an insect. All the witnesses incontrovertibly stated that it was an insect and provided a great deal of information on the cultivation of the plant, of the insect, the harvest, and other matters related to the trade. And these documents are reproduced in Spanish and then translated into French and Dutch. The majority of the informants were local officials, alcaldes or mayors, aides, an attorney. Only one of them is identified as an Indian cacique or notable, Don Francisco Jimenez de Velasco. So in the end, it was American local expertise, not European scientific technology, which settled the scientific controversy, the field, not the laboratory. But although the testimonies and the knowledge they transmitted depended on indigenous expertise and labor, just like the cochineal industry did, the authority and authorship is presented as Spanish. The The majority of the witnesses are not the indigenous laborers who carried out the work, but the plantation overseers who are characterized as Spanish immigrants who had lived for years in Mexico and supervised the cochineal industry. And this question of who has the knowledge, where it is found, and who has the right to speak of it takes us to our third approach to cochineal, which is cochineal as Creole patriotic knowledge. Because while the question of the cochineal's true identity exercised the finest European microscopists and naturalists, Spanish-American naturalists found the confusion characteristic of the myopic ignorance of so-called savants when it came to New World nature. Spanish-American naturalists claimed that European scientists, despite their learning, prestige, or access to instruments and reputable publications, could never manage to know American nature at a distance, as well as American-based scholars knew it firsthand through many years of observations, personal experience, and access to local knowledge. Spanish-American naturalists regularly expressed shock, dismay, and scorn at the many erroneous and at times ridiculous statements that European naturalists made about America in their publications. And they felt particularly indignant about the many European prejudices about American nature and Americans more generally, as the seemingly unending flow of disparaging opinions that began in the 16th century continued to appear in print, and by the 18th century had led to a controversy over the supposed inferiority of American species, including humans, when compared to European ones. To the contrary, these writers countered, America was a privileged land replete with natural wonders and marvels, evidence of God's special affinity for the region. And this combination of patriotic epistemology and providentialist natural history characterizes the treatise on cochineal written by the polymath José Antonio de Alzate Ramírez, a Mexican criollo. In 1777, Alzate penned a lengthy report on the nature, cultivation, and industry of cochineal. Positioned at the nexus of scientific and imperial work, the treatise was first published in Mexico in 1794 in the Gaceta de Literatura, a journal that Alzate himself directed, and then in Madrid in the following year. And the manuscript contains 10 illustrations, which were reconfigured for the publication as 3 copperplate engravings. Alzate's exhaustive memoria addresses every conceivable point regarding cochineal, detailing scientific, agricultural, ethnographic, commercial, and political concerns. The evidence comes both from Alzate's empirical observations of the insect's anatomy and behavior, and from the collected opinions of individuals who were seasoned experts on local matters of cultivation and harvesting. With regard to his own scientific practice, Alzate noted that he and his draftsman examined insects numerous times using a microscope made in Mexico according to his instructions, and 4 of the 10 illustrations feature microscopic observations of insect anatomy. In accordance with the scientific standards of the time, Alzate detailed his observations and experiments, providing numerous corroborating data, such as the exact dates, experimental setups, and steps that each experience involved. For Alzate, only a trained naturalist could correctly interpret the animal bodies and behaviors he witnessed. A lay eye, he asserted, would be misled by the observer's ignorance. So he criticized, for instance, those who believed they were witnessing the spontaneous generation of insects, and also chided a man involved in the cochineal trade in Oaxaca as someone whose, quote, good intentions are matched by his complete lack of knowledge of the true physic or science. This is not to say that Alzate disregarded practical knowledge. He enthusiastically cited at great length several manuscript reports submitted by local experts from Oaxaca, most of them priests who had lived in the region for many decades and who responded in writing to a 17-item questionnaire about cochineal distributed by the friars of the convent of Santo Domingo around 1774. These men provided a wealth of information and detail regarding the different varieties of grana, its pricing over time, the cultivation and care of the insects, their harvesting, the manner of protecting them from predators, the ways in which the district magistrates or alcaldes mayores oversaw indigenous labor and compensation, and many other details. Alzate valued knowledge from the field, highlighting details such as the fact that indigenous laborers called the vessel in which they gathered the grana a chilcalpestle, and this detail is highlighted in one of the illustrations. In this one on the left, you see an indigenous man portrayed in the act of using a deer tail to brush off the cochineal into a bowl, and then a magnified detail, figure 2, is the instrument, the deer tail, and figure 3 is labeled chilcalpestle to provide the indigenous name for the vessel. And he noted many indigenous customs and whenever possible used indigenous terms referring to, quote, their elegant language. Those in the field, Alzate's work suggested, could contribute their particular expertise in cultivation, preparation, and harvesting, but they should leave the scientific part of the story to him. While cochineal was the ostensible subject of Alzate's treatise, a second theme suffuses the publication, the conflict between the European and American investigations of New World nature. Alzate called into question whether it was even possible for Europeans to produce true knowledge of American nature at a distance and without the breadth and depth of experience that American scientists had accumulated. He repeatedly criticized European naturalists throughout the publication, marveling at how very little they knew about Mexican plants and animals. He cited, for instance, an incredulous European author who expressed uncertainty about the existence of the ajolote, a Mexican salamander, finding this simply laughable. Anyone in Mexico, he wrote, would be familiar with the animal. He decried as, quote, ridiculous and absurd the article that the famous microscopist Anton van Leeuwenhoek had published in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions. And he provides a Spanish translation of an English account by John Ellis entitled Account of the Male and Female Cochineal Insects. And the translation contains lengthy expository footnotes that range from the critical to the sarcastic to the outrage. It's really the revenge of the translator. The vast majority of European literature on American nature, Alzate complained, contained appalling mistakes, as it depended on reports from untrustworthy informants, themselves filled with lies and inaccuracies. True knowledge of American nature, Alzate proposed, could only originate in America. But it is important to note that his vision was one in which there was he proposed a fundamental division between indigenous expertise characterized as uninstructed labor and what he called, quote, true science, which belonged to the criollo elites. So what we find when we look at the various approaches to cochineal throughout this period is that although indigenous environmental knowledge was fundamental to the cochineal industry, it was itself subjected to a colonial extractive process that distinguished expertise from labor, assigned epistemic value only to the former, and presented it as emerging from Spanish and criollo administrators rather than from indigenous practitioners. And I want to suggest that this is sort of the long life of a long-standing and insidious imperial ideology that viewed the American landscape and American indigenous people as characterized by a wilderness that required European cultivation. And we see this view articulated so to circle back from the late 18th century to the 1540s, a time when cochineal is becoming a global commodity. We see this view articulated in a lavish manuscript atlas that was painted in France in the mid-1500s. And in this particular map, we see the portrayal of an imaginary encounter between Europeans and American natives in Brazil. And let me show you in detail. So the painting highlights an imagined contrast between indigenous people and Europeans, in which Native Americans are characterized by, on the one hand, an overabundance of nature, and on the other, a lack of culture, both calling for European intervention. Naked Amerindians freely give what they have: parrots, monkeys, and above all, the landscape to produce natural commodities, in this case, the logs of Brazil wood that are prominently displayed at the top right of this detail. In exchange, they receive, as portrayed here at the front, European technology in the form of tools and instruments. By 1600, this imaginary had become the central European trope about the Americas and Americans, as famously portrayed in Stradana's well-known engraving of, again, an entirely imaginary first encounter between Amerigo Vespucci and an indigenous woman, which adds gender to the European calculus that envisions a supposed exchange between lack and plenty, in which Europe is the sole possessor of technology, religion, and military might, and thus entitled to the American landscape, American knowledge, and American people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for a fantastic glimpse into, what is a much larger body of work that really brings together all of these topics. And I'm really excited to see this, which I understand is part of your current project, the larger current project, or are you? How does this fit in your work now?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. This is sort of an excursus. Is not really part of the current project. The current project is sort of expanding my sort of long-standing interest in the processes of circulation and on the role of images in the production of knowledge and the role of indigenous knowledge in these colonial transactions. And so the current book project is focused on the Codex Mendoza. I showed you just a one page, the one with the cochineal economy. And I am writing a book that traces the Codex Mendoza from its production in Mexico in the 1540s through its travels through Europe and through its many printed reproductions. It turns out that it was the single most studied and researched and commented non-European object in Europe until the mid-19th century. So I'm very much focusing on this history of codices and books and images and words and collecting. But the cochineal is something that is sort of a long-standing interest. And I was curious in talking to landscape designers and historians and architects in how this would fit, or what the response would be to this unsuccessful attempt to investigate an indigenous knowledge that was constantly getting sort of pushed to the side as labor, not knowledge. When these reports are filled with incredible details about all the work that it takes to produce these very specific sort of biologically stable situation for the cochineal to be grown and at that scale and produced. So the interest in the sort of conjunction of empire, science, and the natural world and the visual is the connection. But this was just something I just sort of can't keep myself from going into because it's just so fascinating.
Well, it certainly brings out the, let's say, distinctions or binaries we are constantly trying to undo today as we're facing, all of the crisis and the drama of the reality of globalization and the environment. I mean, these distinctions between center and periphery, or the metropolis and the colonial societies, or the imitation versus the original, or nature or knowledge versus technology. All of these things that you bring about are central to how we're trying to redirect and rethink actually how we know landscape and how we should work with it, including, this, I find very poignant, the discussion from the criollo scientists who say, who are telling the Europeans, if you've never come here, you don't have the authority to speak about this or to act on it, much less to describe it. And it gives us a lot to think about in terms of our own work, how we choose to work. How do we do field work? How do we engage with other voices, other cultures, other matter, etc.? So it's very interesting to see these echoes, from a distance to today.
I will say that, I think that also present moments get falsely projected backwards, and this question of center and periphery was one that was very much contested by Spanish American authors at the time, who were saying, well, if you want to know about cochineal, the center is Oaxaca, not the Royal Society. You guys don't know anything. So the footnotes in Alzate's translation are marvelous. They're like a postmodern novel, because he is just laughing at the text that he is translating and saying, like, look at these barbarous people who don't know anything and they publish these things. He says, anyone who goes to a mercado, to a market, knows more than they do. So there is a very, very strong challenge to this presumed authority of European science, while at the same time, this conviction that the problem is not with science, right, but with who can do the right science and where that is based, So there's this critique of people who have never been there. And then there's also this critique later of people like Humboldt, who sort of waltz through the continent in 5 years and think that they know so much. This makes very, very creates very cranky responses from people who say, I've been working on this for 40 years, not 4 months.
Yeah. Yes. And before the questions are accumulating here, but just before we get to more questions, how does the story end? What happened? Did
cochineal
we go to chemical dyes, or what happened?
Yes, we go to aniline. So cochineal, the French tried to grow it, the Dutch tried to grow it in Indonesia, the English tried to grow it in India. It is really a Spanish monopoly, and all these imperial competitors are trying to develop their own plantations and are unsuccessful. And with the rise of the chemical dye industry in the mid-19th century, the market for cochineal just changes dramatically. It continues to be used, but it is no longer the preferred one. I mean, it continues to be used today, and until recently, it's a very stable colorant. So it was used in textiles, it was used in paints, it was used in the food industry. Until recently, Campari was colored. The red of Campari came from cochineal until it was not commercially useful for the manufacturers, because then it's not vegan. So now Campari is vegan, but the production continues in Oaxaca.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to now go to the questions. I will start with our own Ed Eigen, who's a big fan of yours. And he is asking what he's calling an open-ended question. One of the characteristics of dye stuff is fastness, its ability to maintain its colors without fading away. And at which point does indigenous knowledge become lost, mixed, faded, tainted? The moment it is written and or translated down by colonizers, or is that one means necessary for accessing and maintaining this knowledge for non-indigenous people?
Thank you. That's a nice metaphor of the fastness of knowledge. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you for that. So it's interesting. I need to think about what I want to do with that. I think that I am very suspicious of explanations of purity and contamination, and especially sort of what ideals of purity end up meaning for indigenous knowledge, because they end up presenting this view of something ahistorical, unchanging, sort of almost mystical, but that isn't human, right? And so indigenous knowledge is not the same in the 1700s than in the 1500s or the 1300s, just like any knowledge. So that is something that matters a lot to me, to give the agency of historicity to all my historical actors as a historian, and not to assume that there is an unchanging nature to indigenous knowledge. I think that one thing that is vastly transformed in the colonial period is the scale, because basically what was a very small industry that was for both local consumption in the Mixteca and for imperial tribute to the Mexica becomes this mega global industry. So that implies a enormous transformation of the production techniques. From what I can tell, and most of the historical sources are written by either Spanish administrators or criollos. But from what I can tell, the techniques are sort of pretty consistent and have to do with how to care for the plants and care for the bugs, and the super meticulous process Alzate talks of cochineal as being a delicate maiden, requiring a lot of attention with another gendered metaphor. But there's all of this embodied knowledge, tacit knowledge that is in the plantations and that is handled by indigenous people. So that must be coming from there, but we don't know how it changes. What we do know is that what really kills, or what really impacts the indigenous knowledge of these techniques is not colonialism, but the chemical industry, where the economic incentive disappears and the need for cochineal agriculture at that scale disappears, and indigenous communities stop producing it for long enough that between the second half of the 19th century and the contemporary period, there's a lot of loss of knowledge that has been regenerated in recent years. So not disappearance, but the loss of the industry is what really transformed the indigenous expertise.
And as they're trying to find out about the cochineal itself, whether, what kind of an insect it is, etc., what it needs, are they also simultaneously trying to figure out what the opuntia, the prickly pear, means environmentally, botanically? I mean, what is the parallel? What are the other components of this system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the prickly pear, the nopal or opuntia, is central to the Mexica empire. The name Tenochtitlan, it comes from the word Nochtli, which is the Nahuatl for prickly pear, and the legend of the foundation of the Mexica Aztec is of a migration and settling in a place where an eagle is on top of a prickly pear. So the prickly pear is incredibly important symbolically for the Mexica, and this has led ethnobotanists and ethnohistorians to wonder just what it means to have an insect that is the blood of the prickly pear symbolically, right? There's no more potent, metaphorically potent plant for the Mexica. But the opuntia is transplanted, and it's called the Indian fig by Europeans, Ficus indica, and it is growing in European botanical gardens by the end of the 16th century, and in European colonies in different regions. And that's, for example, what makes Hans Sloane in the 1720s think like, well, we have the cactus growing. Now, if we can just get the cochineal, we can surely make this work. But they never can. So they can grow the cactus, but they cannot produce the plantations.
Which required a great massive quantities of them.
Massive quantities of the cactus, but more than anything is the production of the insect. The insect is not the wild cochineal. The wild cochineal is not effective. They call it grana silvestre, is the one that is naturally occurring. And so the one that is used for the dyes, they call grana fina, cochinilla fina, the fine cochineal. And so these reports that I was showing you and talking about, they talk about it's a year-long process where in December and January you have to chop down the pencas, what is the word? Of the cactus, and then you have to take some live insects and place them one by one on the cochineal, and there's these descriptions about how you place it and it will never stay where you want it to stay. So they developed this technique of placing it. It says, place it on the north side of the leaf, and then it will wander by itself to the south side, where is where you want it to end. And it's the eggs of the female cochineal that produce this. So there's this entire process of planting, mating, growing, and then harvesting, and then drying. They're doing all these experiments. One of the reports says, we weren't sure what was the best way to dry it, so we tried 5 different ways. And here's the first experiment with it, and here's the second, and they're trying to see how to stabilize this, how to transform what is a living natural creature into a stable commercial product that can be exported, and that is
produced predictably.
Yes, and that is stable.
And so to clarify, the knowledge developed by the Aztecs was, these let's say increase the production of the cochineal, or were they just completely natural? Or were they manipulating the processes in order to make more?
So the cochineal is grown mostly in an area that is not an agua region, it's a mixtec region, so it's a different indigenous group, different language, and they develop the techniques for producing this dye, right, for cultivating the kind of cochineal that is not the wild cochineal, but that will yield a product. What changes in the colonial period is the scaling up of these into these huge plantations, which require, we don't know how the techniques, or I don't know at least, how the techniques change when it goes from the low scale production to the huge scale production. But every single report always talks about the Indians do this, the Indians do that. So it's always the administrators hanging out in the fields and looking at what the laborers are doing and writing it down, and then saying, oh, but these people are lazy and know nothing, so they need our help to make this work. So it's this complete sort of expropriation of the knowledge and redefinition of it as labor.
Thank you for that. Samantha Nadel asks, you mentioned that Hernán Cortés sent a sample of cochineal back to Spain in 1518, 1 year before he sailed to Mexico. What evidence have you seen for pre-Hispanic trade in cochineal between Mesoamerica and the Caribbean, besides what is implied by this fact?
Yeah, I am really not the expert on the pre-contact history of cochineal, and there has been amazing work done, in part in relation to these 2 exhibitions that I discussed, where there was a lot of analyses that were performed of museum objects to establish the presence of cochineal. So a lot of the science that was done was very, very recent. And we know that cochineal is also present in Andean pre-contact objects, and that there is an Andean cochineal. And there's different varieties. There's a Polish cochineal, but I am sorry, I'm not the right person to answer that question.
Our own Paige Johnston asks, what did the rise of artificial pigments in the 19th century mean for the indigenous communities and economies built up during cochineal's peak?
Yeah. I mean, what it means is an incredible sort of loss of livelihood, but also loss of indigenous knowledge, because when the large-scale production dries up, all of a sudden that expertise is no longer commercially viable for the communities. So for example, the textile industry in Oaxaca itself turned to chemical dyes, and all of that knowledge was lost for generations, not entirely, but very, very majorly. And there have been efforts by indigenous weavers and by ethnobotanists to sort of reinvigorate that indigenous practice. So there's wonderful work being done in Oaxaca with sort of restarting the use of natural dyes and natural pigments for the dye industry, but basically the chemical dyes, not just for cochineal, but for so many natural dyes, suspended that, and the knowledge was lost.
See, Alan Wu asks, there appears to be a revival of Western interest in cochineal today as consumers seek to reduce use of artificial chemical colorants. And what has been the recent effect on indigenous workers and cultures of this new interest in?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I feel like as a historian, I'm the wrong person to answer this authoritatively. I was just alluding to this work that is being done by ethnobotanists and by indigenous artisans in sort of reviving this knowledge, but I think it remains a pretty small scale and sort of luxury indigenous arts kind of project at the point, as far as I know. We need an ethnobotanist here or an anthropologist who's working on this to answer this more authoritatively. That's why I put that bracket, 1500 to 1800. Yeah, and what I was trying to suggest with that ending, which is a provocation, to return to these old tropes, 16th century tropes, and to suggest that they are so pervasive that they end up dominating sort of again and again responses to indigenous knowledge, is to argue that the colonial element of this story is what is specific to this period, but that and that sort of like is a dead end street, an epistemic dead end, because of these consistent and pervasive imagining of the natural landscape of the Americas and the native populations as sort of these double-sided overabundance of nature and lack of knowledge, and both of them imagined as sites for imperial intervention, whether we are talking about the Spanish Americas or other regions of the Americas. So I think that more than cochineal as a case study, what I am proposing is that it shows how that sort of colonial epistemic cannot be untied for the entirety of this period.
Daniela, I'm going to change the subject a little bit.
Yes.
I very much like your essay, your recent essay, Painting the Aztec Past in Early Colonial Mexico, Translation and Knowledge Production in the Codex Mendoza. And I was very fascinated by the radical approach that you take, where you analyze the document not only through reading text, word, and image, but that you look at actually the way it was made, and you applied stratigraphical approach to the page, literally starting from the empty page and working your way through these physical depositions of layers of images and textual information. And, you know, nothing in reality, nothing can be closer to landscape than depositions of stratigraphy. But also that you find meaning in process and not just the form of these drawings. And what does that do for you? And I understand it allows, in the case of that, text allows you to break from more traditional modes of looking from the outside. In a way, it's your own way of traveling right into the site of production, as you just described. That the colonial scientists, with the Spanish American scientists, were calling for. But could you expand on that? How? This is so remarkable
just
to me.
Thank you. I just to sort of share with everyone else what you're talking about is an article that I published in the Renaissance Quarterly, which is the Journal for Renaissance Studies, last year or 2 years ago. You know, COVID time is really squishy.
Yes.
And it's from the book that I am writing about the Codex Mendoza. And I, as somebody who works on the history of books, I was very interested in thinking of a book not as a finished object that we open and read, but as something that comes into being from the raw materials. And you're very perceptive that this interesting process is something that is always central to my work. I'm very interested in, you know, what some anthropologists have characterized as the difference between things and objects, and how a thing becomes a certain kind of object. And I am particularly interested in knowledge objects, scientific illustrations, or books that are considered as sort of repositories of knowledge. And the Codex Mendoza is prized as a very, very early and very, very rich resource on the Mexica world, and for the reason it's often used as if it were a pre-contact manuscript when it's actually a colonial manuscript. And we have so little information for many of these indigenous manuscripts about the people who made them, and sort of the process of knowledge production. And with the Codex Mendoza, as you say, we have this unique opportunity because he has a statement about how it was made. And so that allowed me to sort of slice it a different way. As you say, I call it stratigraphic, a process in which I start with the empty, with a blank piece of European paper, and then look at the layering of statements, indigenous paintings, and then statements that are no longer visible, but that are still captured in the book, such as a Nahuatl language recitation, and then a oral Spanish interpretation of the spoken Nahuatl, and then the final step being the Spanish writing. So we see sort of the first and the fourth acts, but there's this oral translation that is invisible but still present. And so we cannot do that. I had a question from, when talking about this paper, from a medievalist who's like, oh, can we do this with all medieval manuscripts? Because that would be so helpful. And I was like, I don't know, it depends on whether the manuscripts give you that information. But with that manuscript, we do, and by recreating process, we see, I mean, I really like what you're suggesting, that the production of knowledge is a landscape. and that it has these deposits, these layers, not just of human activity, but of the sort of matter of the knowledge that is in them as well. But whether you're talking about codices and manuscripts or botanical illustrations, part of what interests me is how do you start with something which is alive, whether it's a plant or a bug or sort of a native tradition, and turn it into something that is deposited and stabilized for transport. And then that moves across space, but also across time, and gets somewhere where people try to make sense of it. And as a historian, I feel like we are part of that chain of interpretation when we are looking at these layers and trying to sort of ask our own questions about the past.
And of course, you also, one of the central theses of your work is that the images themselves,
yes,
are more central to the production of knowledge than the texts or the spoken descriptions of these plants or animals.
I think that I have written of this as visual epistemology, and I think that this was, I mean, not only many other historians of science and historians of visual culture have pointed out that one of the things that characterizes the early modern period is the rise of images as knowledge objects. And so I think that this is particularly the case in the Spanish Americas. And that in again, these are like sort of older histories that then get projected back. But when you stop thinking that that images are science, and you have an empire that produces a lot of images, is one of the ways in which you can say it did not produce science, it did not produce knowledge. When you say that the images are not knowledge. Which would have made no sense in their early modern period.
Well, thank you, Daniela. I am afraid we have now come to the conclusion of this wonderful talk. And thank you for a great talk and an engaging conversation. And I hope to see you in real space and time sometime soon.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your invitation and your questions, and for this very nice idea that I will take with me of books as landscapes. I'm interested in pursuing that. So thank you so much.
To be continued. And thank you to the audience for coming and for all your questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.